Expert Authority World. I thought I was going to get to take a break. Apparently not. And I told Claudia I'd do this, so I was actually getting ready to relax and everything, so don't mind this. And I've been in a box my whole life. So I'm not going back in the box right now. We're going to do this, and you're going to enjoy it. So, Claudia, this is for you. Expert Authority World, this is for you. I said last time we have to... Oh my gosh. Hold on one second. This has been an eventful day. Growing to 600. And we need the intros. So, let's see if I can beat my record of 14 minutes or 11 or whatever. This is nice. Should I wear polos? Do you like the suit and tie? I like it. I think it's great, but I want to go on the boat. I want to get dinner. I want to relax. You can still ask me the same questions. Here we go. Claudia, here's 500 to 600. Set the stopwatch too. Shabizzle. Going? I think I already did 500. EA Interviews, episode 501. EA Interviews, episode 502. EA Interviews, episode 503. EA Interviews, episode 504. EA Interviews, episode 505. EA Interviews, episode 506. EA Interviews, episode 507. EA Interviews, episode 508. EA Interviews, episode 509. EA Interviews, episode 510. EA Interviews, episode 511. EA Interviews, episode 512. EA Interviews, episode 513. EA Interviews, episode 514. EA Interviews, episode 515. EA Interviews, episode 516. EA Interviews, episode 517. EA Interviews, episode 518. EA Interviews, episode 519. EA Interviews, episode 520. EA Interviews, episode 521. EA Interviews, episode 522. EA Interviews, episode 523. EA Interviews, episode 524. EA Interviews, episode 525. EA Interviews, episode 526. EA Interviews, episode 527. EA Interviews, episode 528. EA Interviews, episode 529. EA Interviews, episode 530. EA Interviews, episode 531. EA Interviews, episode 532. EA Interviews, episode 533. EA Interviews, episode 534. EA Interviews, episode 535. EA Interviews, episode 536. EA Interviews, episode 537. EA Interviews, episode 538. EA Interviews, episode 539. EA Interviews, episode 540. EA Interviews, episode 541. EA Interviews, episode 542. EA Interviews, episode 543. EA Interviews, episode 544. EA Interviews, EA Interviews, episode 544. EA Interviews, episode 545. EA Interviews, nope. EA Interviews, episode 546. EA Interviews, episode 547. EA Interviews, episode 548. EA Interviews, episode 549. EA Interviews, episode 5... What? EA Interviews, episode 548. EA Interviews, episode 549. EA Interviews, episode 550. EA Interviews, episode 551. EA Interviews, episode 552. EA Interviews, episode 553. EA Interviews, episode 554. EA Interviews, episode 555. EA Interviews, episode 556. EA Interviews, episode 557. EA Interviews, episode 558. EA Interviews, episode 559. EA Interviews, episode 560. EA Interviews, episode 561. EA Interviews, episode 562. EA Interviews, episode 563. EA Interviews, episode 564. EA Interviews, episode 565. Miko, how are you? EA Interviews, episode 565. EA Interviews, episode 566. EA Interviews, episode 568. EA Interviews, episode 567. EA Interviews, episode 569. EA Interviews, episode 70? EA Interviews, episode 570. EA Interviews, episode 571. Dang it. Home stretch. I'm going to kill my record. EA Interviews, episode 571. EA Interviews, episode 572. EA Interviews, episode 573. EA Interviews, episode 574. EA Interviews, episode 575. EA Interviews, episode 576. Nope. EA Interviews, episode 570. What the heck? 70. EA Interviews, episode 575. EA Interviews, episode 576. EA Interviews, episode 577. EA Interviews, episode 578. EA Interviews, episode 579. EA Interviews, episode 580. EA Interviews, episode 581. EA Interviews, episode 582. EA Interviews, episode 583. EA Interviews, episode 584. EA Interviews, episode 585. EA Interviews, episode 586. EA Interviews, episode 580 whatever. EA Interviews, episode 587. EA Interviews, episode 588. EA Interviews, episode 589. EA Interviews, episode 589. EA Interviews, episode 590. EA Interviews, episode 591. EA Interviews, episode 592. EA Interviews, episode 593. EA Interviews, episode 594. EA Interviews, episode 595. EA Interviews, episode 596. EA Interviews, episode 597. EA Interviews, episode 598. EA Interviews, episode 599. EA Interviews, episode 600. 715. That's going to be hard to beat again. Miko, how are you? Well, Claudia, that's it. I'm not going to turn this into a full-length episode and everything. There was a Just Great one with, there was a Just Great one. Publisher, author, host, how I speak is beyond me. But there was a Just Great one with Angela Duncan. Check it out. And I'm going to wrap this up. I'll see you on the next one. Claudia, here we go. We're at 600. Here's to 700. And for everyone who watches this, thank you. I appreciate it. It's surreal. And thank you. Let me know what we can do to help. All right, Expert Authority World. We have another great episode here today. I'll see you on the next one. Have a great day.